very good evening, everyone, to, I don't know which episode of Right Circle it is, but it's been more than 6.5 years. It's presented by Shri Simmons, and we are also associated with SAS for Women from Jaipur and the Spagia Foundation. And it gives me so much joy to welcome two very strong women. Our speaker for today is Lisa Ray, and I don't think she needs an introduction. Everyone knows who she is, what she's all about, the kind of gravitas and substance that she carries, the kind of roles she's done. She's started modeling at 16 and has always been known for chasing issue-driven content, and has been part of the Oscar-nominated film Water. She's also been seen on many contemporary shows like Four More Shots Please, in Top Chef in Canada. She's also worked with A.R. Rahman on his first production, 99 Songs. But most importantly, Lisa's here with us today because she's written this most, I don't know what to call it, unputdownable, close to the bone, and she's working on the next book. So you can just kind of wait and see what she's going to be up to very soon. And sparkling in conversation with her is Pragya Tiwari, who again, as far as the world of publishing and journalism goes, does not need action. She Talbots, who has 15 years of experience as a journalist behind her, has led publications like Vice India, Tehelka, The Big Indian Picture as an editor, has written profusely and very voraciously on politics, policy, fashion, arts, culture, books, theatre. So you can see how versatile Pragya is. And if I complete the list of all the publications, it'll take up more of our time. So Pragya, you'll have to forgive me for that. Lisa, Pragya is also, I think you guys have chatted, but just to let our audiences know, what they've suggested for all of you here is that while Pragya is doing the conversation with Lisa, you guys can send questions and she'll rope them into the conversation while she is talking to Lisa. So I'm going to hand it over to these two absolutely wonderful women whom I look up to. Thank you for joining.
Oh my goodness. Thank you, Meeta.
Round of applause. But I guess everyone will be applauding you both at the end of it. So over to both of you.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. Yes, I just wanted to say thank you, Meeta. I'm very, very humbled, and I'm so pleased to be here. Actually, at again, such a literary focused kind of a discussion is really where my heart lies these days, and I'm honored to do this, and I'm honored to be doing this with Pragya. And again, Meeta, thank you. You're also someone I admire greatly and deeply for your commitment to the literary community in India. And let's get this show started.
Let's do that. And everything that Lisa said and some. Thank you, Meeta. Lisa, may I just start by saying what a pleasure it's been to reread your book. Like I was saying to you yesterday, it's been an absolute pleasure, and I'm so glad that I rediscovered the book, particularly in the times that we're in at this moment. For those of you who haven't read the book, before I read the book, I was a lot of blurbs and a lot of sort of introductory couple of sentences about the book said that it was a memoir about someone who had survived cancer, someone who had undergone a very serious illness and come out the other side. But when I read the book, it is just so much more than that, as all fabulous memoirs really are. It's not just about Lisa's entire life, but it's about so much more. It's about our lives. It's about everything that, it's about really the human condition. And that is what makes it a spectacular book. And I don't know if I can do that story in justice, but just to give you a sense of this sort of ambit of the book, I'm going to be asking Lisa some questions about the themes in her book and the kinds of things that she's written about. So I'm going to start with, every story, Lisa, has a context. And to my mind, the context to your story, like with a lot of us, is your parents' story. Their sort of very unlikely marriage, their sort of almost anachronistic adventurism, their just willingness to live an out-of-the-box life. Could you tell us a little bit about them, and perhaps also your grandparents, to give us a sense of, how different these two worlds were that came together to make you?
Well, thank you, Pragya. I think that I didn't have a notion when I was a little girl that anything in my life was unusual. That sort of notion of the fact that, there was a kind of a separateness to my identity from a lot of other people around us, only obviously happened much later on in my teens. But, for me, it was perfectly natural that, my mother and my father might come from literally opposite cultural ends of the spectrum. And I somehow thought that perhaps everybody else's, genesis was similar. But what ended up happening is I spent a lot of my childhood in Calcutta, even though I was born and brought up in Toronto. And perhaps, Canada was turned out to be a very fertile, let's say, country for the intermingling of two very different cultures. Because, of course, Canada is a very accepting, open society. And when my parents met, it was the 1960s, and it was a very improbable union between, as they said, a young woman, blonde, blue-eyed, from behind the Iron Curtain, because Poland, of course, was a closed country in those days, and a young, idealistic PhD student from Calcutta, who was very shy and very introverted and never conditioned to look for love outside of prescribed kind of notions. He had actually let's say a rishta that was waiting for him in Calcutta. So I think that, the thing is that identity, when I look at my identity, and, also when I was young and storming through life, I sort of had this notion of myself as being a rebel, and nobody can understand me. But when I was writing Close to the Bone, it sort of helped me to understand how it was my parents who were perhaps on some level far more rebellious than I've ever been in my life, far more unconventional and far more courageous. So again, to give you some context, my grandparents, my maternal grandparents were from Poland, just outside of Warsaw, Warszawa. And in fact, my maternal grandfather was originally, I believe, of French stock. So my mother's maiden name is Galus, which is unusual. It's not a very Polish name. Most Polish names end with ski. But Galus actually refers to Gallic. And it is thought that my grandfather is originated from Napoleon's army that were marching through the region and probably broke off, and he was probably sort of succumbed to the local charms, and ended up staying and making a life in Poland. But the last name already is very unusual, Galus. So he and my grandmother was a very big personality. And in fact, when I was very young, my grandmother is the one who came to Toronto and ended up being a very strong influence in my growing up years. So I ended up learning Polish as my first language before any other language. And that's sort of a strange little fact that most people don't know about me, because my grandmother, needless to say, she couldn't speak any English. And she was a very, very interesting personality, very, very colorful, very vibrant. She was all about elegance and elegancia. And, whereas Canada, which represents sort of the new world, was all about shedding old customs and traditions, becoming very, very sort of, let's say, down to earth. my grandmother was still very, very sort of grand and full of pomp and circumstance. And so while my parents were out working, I was sort of her charge. And I think unbeknownst to my parents, she used to actually march me to the Polish neighborhood in Toronto and march me up and down the boulevard while she was sort of socializing and gossiping over tea and ponchki and taking me to church. And my mother is a firm atheist for as long as I can remember. My father is very much a Hindu, but sort of, you know, someone who wasn't very ritualistic about his religion. But my mother was an atheist, so she and my grandmother butted heads. My grandmother was a very, very fervent Catholic. So some of my earliest memories were of being dragged into church and sitting at the back of church and counting all the ladies' hats and seeing these very sort of terrifying dirge-like images of Jesus Christ on the cross and blood everywhere. And it was very, very terrifying for me. But what I like to say is, you know, on the other side of my family, there were correspondingly terrifying images of Kali. So we used to travel to Calcutta probably every second summer from when, you know, I think my first trip was when I was 6 months old, you know, and beyond the reaches of my memory. But my parents narrate the story to me of traveling in those days, the 80s, to Calcutta, particularly during monsoon, which, you know, is far from a romantic time in Calcutta, particularly in the 80s. But for me, it was romantic as a young child. And I really gravitated towards our ancestral home in Shambazar, which is in northern Calcutta, a very, very traditional, old sort of Brahmin stronghold. And I have wonderful memories also of my grandparents. My grandfather was very much, he was a judge. First for the British, and then, you know, after partition, you know, he continued practicing. But he was very much one of those sort of, I don't know how to call it. He was very, you know, like a babu, babu Moshai, you know, wearing his dhoti, and he had a cane and very disciplined, had a very rigorous kind of a routine and ritual to his life. But he was also very much against rituals. So he used to ban gurus and babas and all sorts of rituals from the house. And you know, his great routine was sitting and reading the newspaper with sort of a lot of pomp. There was a very different kind of pomp to my grandfather's life. And my grandmother was an equally sort of, I would say, strong, memorable personality, even though she was married at 14 and basically uneducated. But, you know, I have such strong memories of both sides of my lineage. And somehow or the other, even though, you know, on the surface of it, they stand as such contrast to each other, for me, that was my world. That was all that I knew. And I somewhere balanced somewhere between these worlds, even though I very naturally gravitated towards my Bengali side. For whatever reason, you know, there was something that I internalized on those kind of ritualistic vacations to Calcutta that embedded in me what I like to call an attraction towards the imperfect, an attraction towards the rawness of life that I never saw in suburban Toronto when I was growing up. And so, you know, I never really started dealing with these notions of identity issues until I started, I think, attending high school in Toronto. And I did, of course, growing up in Toronto, I did receive a lot of questions about, well, what are you? And on some level, it's a very Canadian question as well, because Canada, in contrast to America, you know, we refer to America as the melting pot, where you are primarily an American first. Whatever your ethnic background is, that sort of fades into the background. But in Canada, we call it the mosaic. So whatever your ethnic background is or your culture, it sort of fits together with other cultures, and you're allowed to wear it very proudly on your sleeve. Now, the only thing with me is that it was very confusing to people exactly what I was. So when they're asking me, what are you? They're asking, well, what is your ethnicity? And this is, remember, Toronto of the 70s and the 80s, when it was not quite as as cosmopolitan as it is today. I believe that today Toronto is actually one of the most mixed cosmopolitan cities on the planet, statistically speaking. But in those days, I mean, there were still neighborhoods. And the neighborhood that I grew up in was primarily made up of Italian, Portuguese, a lot of Mediterranean kind of cultures. So people, or Greek, and people naturally assume that I was perhaps Italian or Greek or Portuguese or perhaps Iranian at the most. And I found this question very puzzling, that people couldn't immediately identify me for what I was. Yeah. And strangely, I always downplayed my Polish side. I think there were probably a few reasons for it. Number one is I like to provoke people very naturally since I was young. And number two, I always, as I said, gravitated very, very naturally towards my Indian side. So I would sort of straighten myself up to my full height of whatever, 3 feet or whatever it was. And I would say very proudly, but I'm Indian. And, you know, again, there's obviously...
I would put that down to the charms of Calcutta, as somebody who's born and brought up in Calcutta herself, I think.
Yeah, you know, it's that sort of a place, isn't it? You know, once it gets in your blood.
It doesn't.
It gets in your blood and it doesn't let you go. But that was sort of my cultural context in growing up. And I embraced both sides, but I embraced it very organically. You know what I mean? It was very much a fact of my life. When I was young, I didn't struggle with identity, and I wasn't pushed by my parents. My parents, of course, given that they were a mixed marriage, they didn't force anything upon me, nor did they force me to choose from either side. If anything, it was only perhaps my Polish grandmother that kind of tried to turn me into a good Catholic girl, and in order to sort of, I guess, to purge me of my heathen side, as you know, as she saw it, you know. And she was very straightforward and unapologetic about the fact that she thought that, you know, that there was that my father was a heathen. She loved him desperately, but she just did not understand it. She was of that generation that simply did not understand it.
Of course. So Lisa, you know, you mentioned that when you were growing up in Canada, even though you weren't struggling with your identity, thanks to the way in which your parents bring you up, you were asked often, who are you, right?
Yeah.
And to my mind, that is a question that is central to any autobiography, any sort of memoir, right? And
yes,
I, as a writer, I've often wondered what it would be like to sit down and start telling one's own story, and particularly a writer who writes mostly nonfiction. So I'm used to writing other people's stories, right? And I can think of any number of things, any number of questions that one might grapple with, right? For instance, just the very idea of framing your own narrative, and once it's framed, it's there. That's your story, right? You almost can't change it. It's you know, it's sort of, it may not be set in stone, but it's set in words which outlast stones. And then, of course, there are other kinds of questions. For example, how much do you reveal? What is important for you to reveal? How much of it is your story to tell? Because, you know, our lives are made up of, you know, our
intersecting, of course. Yeah, we're intersecting.
People. And, you know, of course, then there is the whole thing about sitting down and confronting different aspects of our lives, right? And memory is a funny thing. It plays some things up, and it's sort of, so again, what we remember, how we remember it, is it really true? I mean, there's just so much sort of dilemma that could underpin the writing of a memoir. Did it come very easily to you, or were these some of the things you found yourself struggling with?
No, well, you know, yes and no. You know, again, that's even a sort of a complex answer. Where do I start? I mean, the genesis of the memoir is rather interesting, and maybe I'll tell that after I sort of share a few thoughts. I mean, what you just said now provoked a few thoughts. There's a few things that I think about now when I think about a memoir. Now, first of all, of course, I think that when you set out to write a book, now I've understood, and of course I'm working on my second one, and I'm still very much consider myself a debut author in so many aspects. It's really terrifying to write a book. I can't you know, sort of sugarcoat that aspect of it. But I think that when you set out to write a book, of course you have a sort of a structure and themes, and there are themes that very naturally have dogged me my whole life, and one of them is identity. you know. And there was another theme of masks, this idea of, you know, being labeled by people. And that, of course, leads to sort of this, I think the real engine, you know, that really got me through writing the book, the days when you're like, oh, this is so hard and I don't see the end, was the incredible power and privilege of being able to seize your own narrative, right? And I think that for whatever reason in my life, because one aspect of my life, not my whole life, but one aspect of my life has been played out so much in the public arena, that I've always had to struggle with this notion that people know me somehow. And people have developed, you know, an impression of me through a project, through some work or an interview or an image that they've seen on the cover of a magazine, and they feel like that's who I am. And of course, that's not at all the case. And often these things actually end up obscuring more than they end up revealing. You know, and for whatever reason, also throughout my life, I always knew that I would write and write books eventually. I've always kept diaries. So I did have a certain wealth of diaries that were written over many, many years, over the last 20 years. Now, these are not diaries that were necessarily traditional, like it's not in me to sort of write, dear diary, here's what happened today. I never did that. But what I would often write were impressions, you know, the way that, you know, a line that stuck with me that, you know, someone would utter at a cocktail party, or the way that the light looked, you know, on the ocean in Goa, or, you know, or conversation I had with somebody on a plane. And these were the things that I would scribble down in my books. It was very impressionistic. And these things actually ended up being great triggers. So there's one aspect of writing a book that is sort of logical. You have to have a sort of a structure and a theme, but I'm not a very logical person at all. And it just doesn't work for me to say, you know, to keep coming back to a theme. You know, I hope that that's along the spine, but I have to write very organically and, you know, and hope that what I want to see is going to come out of these anecdotes in the storytelling. The other thing is that, and again, as I said, being labeled was very much on the days when it was hard to write, was sort of, you know, in a sense, the engine or the fuel for me to sort of continue. There's also, I think, this notion that is hopefully now slowly changing, of the fact that someone like me, who is perceived to be, again, a model or a writer or an actor, right, who is objectified very much by society, can somehow not be a cultural commentator. You know, that power was taken away from someone like me for many years, definitely during the entire 90s in India, so much so that I felt like I had to leave in order to find my own voice. And I think that we're entering, fortunately, a new era now in India where storytelling has changed and it's becoming also democratized. And even though I definitely come from a place of privilege, I'm not, you know, saying that I don't, you know, there's perhaps the audience is more open to hearing my voice. I mean, I would have written the book regardless. I don't think about an audience when I'm writing the book, to be completely honest. But that was very exciting for me, because I do think that I have been in a particularly special position to be a cultural commentator. And often that was dismissed, you know, simply because of how people perceive me. Or, you know, or because I'm on paper uneducated. I chose, in fact, not to go to university, even though my father comes from a very, very, you know, academic background and has his PhD and things like that. And I completely broke with the Ray family tradition. And that was a part of my, you know, defiant nature. I felt like I would learn all I need to learn from life. And I think that that's what's happened. So I felt that it was also a way of...
Sorry to interrupt you, but that actually brings me to a question that I've been meaning to ask, right? When was the germ? I mean, I know about the wonderful incident that you write about jogging on Juhu Beach and being stopped in your tracks, literally, and being asked if you'd like to work in films by somebody who you didn't instantly recognize to be fun if you told if you narrated that anecdote. But was that the first germ of the idea that you might want to be in the sort of glamour industry, which is what it was broadly known as at that point in time? Or was that something, I mean, before that, did you have any idea of what you wanted to be, or you know, what you wanted to become when you grow up?
Well, I'm so glad you asked me that question, Pragya, because again, that was perhaps another one of the driving themes behind Close to the Bone was being able to share my story authentically and in a way that that would explain how serendipity has worked in my life. Now, first off, I never wanted to be in front of the camera. I still don't want to be in front of the camera. I have these moments where I think, oh my God, you know, what am I doing? So there is this strange, irrational push and pull. I mean, of course, you know, now I've been doing this for so many years that it still is staggering to me. And it's staggering to me that, you know, even that I get dragged into or offered projects that still end up being quite high profile and successful. But I genuinely never, ever wanted to be an actor. And when I used to say that to people in casual conversation or even in interviews over the years, people would look at me with disbelief, or they would, you know, dismiss me, or they would say, well, then how are you doing what you're doing? And that was another one of the reasons why I felt like I have to write Close to the Bone, because very, very sincerely, I never, ever wanted to be an actor or a model or in front of the camera. And I'm very, very ill-suited for it, believe me. So essentially what ended up happening is I was on a sabbatical in Bombay with my parents, and I was 16. And of course, at the same time, I was very adventurous. I had this notion of life as being, you know, sort of a smorgasbord of adventures, and I wanted to take a taste of everything possible. I also had this strange image. I'd read an article with actually an actress that I greatly admired called Isabelle Adjani, because I grew up on a diet of meaningful cinema. That was the Bengali side of me, and that was what my father fed me. My father was a cinemaphile, but he was very dismissive of anything to do with commercial Bollywood and even commercial Hollywood. It was all about meaningful cinema. So, so basically, sorry, just for a moment, I lost my thread of thought.
You were talking about Isabella and
yes. Isabelle Adjani. So basically, I read an interview with Isabelle Adjani, who was an actress I really admired, a French actress, and somebody had spoken about her. They had said she's a cat, you know. Someday she'll just show up at your door, and she'll find a little corner in your house, and she'll stay with you, and then you wake up one day and she's gone. And I had this notion. I said, "Wow!" As you know, as a young woman, I said, "Wow, can you really live that way?" I mean, remember, I was living this very, very sedate, very prescribed kind of a life in suburban Toronto at that time, and it's a life that a lot of people aspire to. But I wanted anything else except for that life. So that notion really burrowed within me, and I thought, wow, that is actually possible. So that was what I was going for. I definitely wanted a life of adventure, but when I was in Bombay and I was jogging one morning on Juhu Beach, and I was often actually harassed on Juhu Beach, but I was you know, quite defiant about it. I used to actually just fling sand in obnoxious old uncles' faces and continue on my way. But then one morning there was a gentleman who said, "Excuse me." There was something about the tone of his voice that actually made me stop, even though I had a fistful of sand in my hand. And I turned around and I confronted him. And he definitely had this aura. There was this man standing there, and he had this very confident aura. And he said, "Have you thought about films?" And I mean, it really, really took me aback. Of course, there was one aspect of me that was flattered, because I was a young, lost, confused young girl, like we all are in our teens. And there was another aspect that was just horrified, honestly horrified at the notion of acting in front of people. And not just that, you know, I mean, we're in Bombay, so obviously we're assuming that what he's referring to is Bollywood. So on top of that, dancing in front of people was far beyond my conception. You know, I was very introverted, very shy. And I said, no, very simply, I said, no, I've never thought about it. And he said, well, you know, I think you have potential. Here's my card. Please come in and see me. And he handed me his card. And then he walked away. And I kind of stood there. I was rooted to the spot for just a moment. And I looked at, you know, turned it around and I looked at the name on it and it said Shekhar Kapoor. Where have I heard that name? Remember, this is the pre-digital era. We were not bombarded with information, but of course I knew his work. I had seen was it Mr. India?
Yeah.
I mean, you know, the fact that I did not want to be in Bollywood did not mean that I did not watch Bollywood films. I did watch them. That was sort of also part of my cultural mosaic and my upbringing, but I didn't want to be a part of them. So that horrified me, but that was the first hint. I mean, there I was in Bombay. And in those days, in the early 90s, believe me, there were no agents, there were no, you know, managers, there were no PR people, there was nothing. It was a very coupled together kind of an industry, the entertainment industry. And so those were the days, very much that you've perhaps heard those myths also in Hollywood about certain actresses that were sort of discovered, right? And I don't know if that was a spin, you know, sent out by Hollywood studios, but I was literally just discovered, and that was a fact of life in those days in Bombay in the early 90s. I know a lot of other girls who were literally just discovered. It was like somebody saw somebody at a party or, you know, on Juhu Beach, and they made a few phone calls and then suddenly you found yourself in front of the camera.
So, you know, something that really struck me from what you just said is how you wanted to be able to tell your own story, you wanted to seize your narrative, particularly as somebody who came from an industry and where, you know, it's often thought that you cannot you cannot have dimensions beyond what is projected, right?
Yes.
And I'm thinking of you as a teenager. You must have been, what, 16 or 17? Or, you know, you were very young when you got your first cover shoot. And you were famous all of a sudden as a teenager, as a kid, and you were thrust into this sort of world of Bombay parties and, you know, modeling and so on and so forth. And of course, what comes with the deal is becoming a sex symbol, you know, just sort of accepting that you will be, you know, sort of objectified in a way, and when it comes to male gaze in a sense. I'm just trying to imagine what that was like for you at that point in time. How did you deal with the attention, but also sort of the pressure, the image, you know, the focus on your body? And when did, I mean, I guess I'm asking too many questions all at once, but when did it also suddenly, I wonder if you also were alongside beginning to see how things for women were a little bit skewed in the world in general, but also particularly in the industry.
I mean, that's a great question. That's a very big discussion, actually. But, you know, obviously I can speak to my own perspective, but I also wanted to go perhaps in order to answer this a little bit further back, even before India. Of course, you know, I mean, modeling or appearing in a very skimpy red swimsuit in the early 90s is guaranteed to stamp you as a sex symbol, because in those days there were only two archetypes available to women, and either you were the virgin or you were the vamp. So, you know, I was the sex symbol, but I was also the sex symbol for a slightly new India. In 1991, the country was also gradually starting to open up to new possibilities. So, whereas previous to that, I would say that sex symbols were necessarily vampy. Here, there was this possibility of a sex symbol just being aspirational for the first time. So that was all kind of interesting and playing out. But yeah, but it was terrible. But at the same time, what I have to reflect on, in all honesty, is all societies, even growing up in Canada, particularly in the 80s, which is when I was, you know, a very young teenager, your looks and your sexuality was considered a particularly potent weapon to getting ahead in the world. That's how we were conditioned as young women. And to use your looks either to get ahead professionally or to marry well. So I just wanted to point out that, in the 80s and even the early 90s, these notions were not that different. I mean, there's a different cultural context, obviously, in India, and the patriarchy takes a very different form. But that idea was rampant all over the world, right? This idea of objectifying women. And I grew up through that, even though I didn't grow up, with that kind of notion in my own household, because my mom was extremely liberated, extremely strong. And in fact, the gender stereotypes in my family were reversed. It was my mother who was very strong, who would pick up a wrench and fix things in the house. And my father was very gentle and very dreamy and very artistic and things like that. So that's what I grew up with. And yet when I was sort of ejected out into the world, there were other influences that I internalized. So when I ended up being in India, and completely serendipitously, and I don't want to get into it in too much detail, obviously I've written about it in much more detail in the book. So I serendipitously ended up on the cover of this magazine and becoming an overnight sensation in India, and then ended up moving there and spending a decade up until my 30s. I really struggled. I really, really struggled because, of course, I felt that it was so far, this image was so far, so diametrically opposite to who I was, that it was really, hard to reconcile the two. And at the same time, I was healing from a trauma. And I was still a young woman looking for validation, looking for direction. I didn't know who I was. I had not found my voice, but I was sure that that was not who I was. I was not just a sex symbol. And so I ended up, acting out quite a lot. I ended up trying to do everything I could to defy what people thought I was of me. At the same time, because we're complex creatures, I consented to all of these shoots, and I consented to making a lot of money, and I consented to, at the same time, building this image, because, there were a lot of perks to it. And at the same time, I never aspired to be an actor. I did not see this as being a lifetime career. I did it because I wanted to be in India, and because I wanted to explore myself. And for me, India was always the hook. And this gave me the only legitimate excuse when you are a teenager to actually live in India on your own, right? Because I actually had a career and people were paying me to be there. But I really struggled with it. And often the biggest struggle was not with strangers and other people's perceptions. It was people within your inner circle. There was sort of a casual sexism, and I'm sure it persists even to today, but I think that I'm become so much of a dragon that, even in the industry today, people wouldn't dare sort of drop these kinds of casually sexist remarks around me. But, little things, like I've written about this one incident that's really obviously stayed with me. These are my friends, and we're sitting around, and, advertising in those days was the place to be. That was where all the cool cats hung out. It really wasn't about Bollywood. Bollywood was considered actually very sort of, distasteful, right? So, and I made a lot of very good money in advertising. It was very different in those days because models were actually stars. I did every single campaign. The money was good. I went in and I did a campaign for 2-3 days, and I was paid much better than I would probably be paid for a full-fledged Bollywood film, which would take 2 years. But there I was sitting in a friend's office, and there's a bunch of, advertising execs and friends, and they're all, sitting around chatting and drinking tea and everything like that. And I think I started talking about a Joni Mitchell song or some such thing, because I was hungry. I was hungry for intellectual stimulus. Unfortunately, I still have a very good little circle of friends that I had built up in Bombay that persist to today that, are kind of, they're food candy for me. But anyways, there I was, and I was talking about Joni Mitchell, and somebody ended up talking about, curves and things like that. Yeah, I've never seen as many great curves as I can see here in this room, referring to me. And here's the thing. It was a very sexist remark, but it's coming from a friend. And I still remember thinking as a young woman, I have two choices. If I react to this in the 90s, and there's no framework for feminism, for saying that's not right, what I ended up doing is alienating my friends, and my friends will say, "Don't be so boring, yaar. You know, I mean, it's just a joke, yaar. What's wrong with you? Why is she so boring? Why is she so serious?" You know, I would get shot down, and I would be labeled boring and serious, which is the worst things that you could be labeled in those days. And it kind of, you know, it strangled me. It strangled my voice. I wasn't able, and, you know, so I couldn't, I had to laugh it off, all these jibes. And that was really, really difficult for me, because these were people who knew me. They knew I was not the image. They were part of the creators that would help me create those images. So they knew that I was not that, and yet they were still throwing these at me. It was a real struggle. So what I used to do is I used to act out. I used to, when I was not in front of the camera and being dolled up, I would dress down. My hair was really ragged. To be honest, here's the other thing that I know very much about me, is that I'm very photogenic, but I'm not necessarily very impressive looking in real life. And I don't say that with any, you know, I mean, it simply is a fact. So I would be able to like walk around and kind of act out, and, you know, and even not even bathe for days, because I was just using my body as a form of protest. And I still, if I can just narrate one more incident that I thought was really telling. I'll never forget it. I was sitting at a 5-star hotel and having a coffee on my own, and you know, again, disheveled and whatever. And there was two young lads sitting next to me at the next table, and they looked over at me and they looked me up and down, as they do. And one of them sort of, you know, nudged the other one. He says, "Hey, check her out. She's not bad, huh?" And the other guy sort of looked me up and down, and he said, "Okay, but she's no Lisa Ray." So there I was, hidden in plain sight. And it did do a number on me, for sure. It's something that I struggled with. And perhaps there's a little aspect of me that even today struggles with it. You know, even in the context today, I still think that the celebrity culture of contemporary India is so pervasive. It's so all pervasive. In fact, it's become much more pervasive, of course, given, you know, with the advent of, you know, the digital era and social media. And it's just, as usual, India goes to the nth degree with everything. That I still think that, you know, there's obviously a large swathe of the population that only identifies me as an actor, and a glamorous actor at that, even though I'm like 48. And, you know, and I in fact end up taking on people once in a while on social media and saying, "I hope you understand that, you know, that this is not everything that there is about me." But that sort of celebrity culture and the fan culture in India is something that, you know, it's a monster. It's a many-headed monster, and there's no point in trying to wrangle it. You know, obviously I am very, very content and confident in who I am today. But it's been a long journey.
It has been a wonderful journey, if from what
I it has been a wonderful journey.
But, you know, Lisa, there's so much that you're grappling with that you just spoke about, right? And that's just, of course, the tip of the iceberg.
That's the tip of the iceberg, yeah.
You know, you're dealing with fame, you're dealing with who are you, you're dealing with living alone, you're dealing with India, you're dealing with sort of your interaction with the world, and also simultaneously, you know, you faced an adversity, a really, really big adversity, around that time, in the accident that happened in Canada with the three of you in a car, you and your parents, which left your mother paralyzed, and then of course she was in hospital when you decided to come away to India and you know, start pursuing your career. So there are these two things that a young person is suddenly being, you know, exposed to. One is, of course, fame, and the other is extreme adversity. I mean, if I may say so, perhaps the worst kind of adversity that we can imagine, right? I mean, it's a dread that one still kind of lives with, of something happening to your parents, etc. So how was that playing out parallelly in your life, and how long did it take you to actually be able to make sense of it, and then further perhaps?
No, that's a great question, and that really, it was such a pivotal moment in my life that really sort of set my trajectory. Again, serendipitously set my trajectory. So, you know, my parents and I were involved in a very serious car accident, as a result of which my mom was paralyzed, and it was just sort of inconceivable on some level. I mean, I can say this today, it was perhaps worse than having lost her, than losing her at that point of time, because to see somebody who's so vital, who's so alive, and who's so dynamic being stilled was devastating. And then I did not have the tools to be able to process that. So I ended up running away, and hence I had a career in India. That is really the sort of secret behind why I was propelled to India and why I ended up becoming a model. It simply is, you know, the way I describe it is, it was like literally, for me, fame started on the edge of a blade, you know, because on one side there was this terrible trauma, on the other side there was obviously fame and fortune. And I was, you know, always literally in danger of being sliced in half by trying to navigate those two worlds, or those two situations. So trauma is a strange thing. And trauma is, again, I think one of the central themes to Close to the Bone, how we confront trauma, what we do with trauma, how trauma ends up actually affecting and directing our lives. And I think that it's quite a well researched and well communicated idea today that trauma, that unprocessed trauma doesn't just go away, and can often lead also to, you know, can manifest into physical sicknesses and even psychological sicknesses, etc. And so a lot of my life really was about running away from that trauma and that pain. And I ran and ran and ran and ran until I couldn't run anymore. And so a lot of my journey has been about processing that trauma. And the first glimmer I had of actually starting to process the trauma, again, happened serendipitously, and it happened in drama school when I was in London. So I left India, and because I had definitely hit the metaphorical glass ceiling, I was also running away from a very dysfunctional relationship. You know, of course, I touch on bulimia and other aspects of you know, of my pain that I was navigating through my 20s. And I really do feel that, again, a lot of it had to do with the suppressed trauma. But the first glimmer I had of being able to address the trauma was in drama school, because we did a lot of voice work. And what ends up necessarily happening is you open up your diaphragm and you send your breath deep into, you know, crevices in your body. And often what that does, it ends up opening up suppressed emotions. And that was the first notion that I had. That's actually what attracted me to acting, not the notion of appearing on the screen, but that acting was sort of the strange therapy for me. And in the process of being able to build a character about someone else, you have to understand yourself. So my training really was about getting to the heart of my trauma. That's where I first, I think, started the healing was triggered. And, you know, trauma for me is also braided together with the kind of a spiritual seeking, you know, a kind of a questing for self, for knowing yourself. As we started, you know, at the beginning of the session, as Pragya, you said, this question is, who am I? That is often the central, you know, question in every memoir, in everybody's life, actually. Who am I, and what does this all mean? And that has always actually been very close to the surface for me. You know, and so my spiritual seeking, along with addressing my trauma, has really driven my life, particularly after I left India. And, you know, for me, it's much more real than my career. You know, I mean, I spent many aspects, or many like long periods of my life where I would just drop off the civilization, you know, drop out of sight, and spend, you know, 6 months at a time up in Dharamshala with meditation, and slowly, gently allowing those layers of trauma and pain and conditioning as well to release. So whether the trauma is even gone today or not is not a question in my mind. I think I'm sort of sorry. There's a huge thunderstorm going
Yes,
on right now.
I could hear that all the way up. And
Did
it
you
sounded
hear
very
that?
welcome in this Delhi heat.
So
yes.
by the way, we had a really, sorry, I don't mean to, but we had a huge electrical storm the other night. It woke me up. It was so dramatic that might start again. And that led me to research Singapore. Apparently Singapore is the lightning capital of the world. So you'll have to excuse me if we get these jatkas, right?
Well,
hopefully the power won't go.
from this.
Because that would be weird. But so anyways, that's what I think. I don't even know. I don't like, you know, there are certain traumas. I don't know that you recover from them, but you accept them, you live with them. And, you know, so my journey has been one to acceptance more than anything else, to a place of gratitude and peace and acceptance. It's never about getting rid of something. You know, you go to the root of something and you see it very clearly and you sit with it and you accept it. And it's still, you know, I mean, I still tear up when I think about my mother, when I think about either the accident or then actually, you know, being at her side and, you know, in the hotel when she actually passed. I'll still tear up about that. I accept that grief is just going to be a fact of my life, like it's woven into my life. But the point is I don't brush it aside. And for me, that has been the biggest source of grace in my life, is being able to sit with what is, which is also a very helpful technique to deal with anything in life. Life is uncertain. I mean, life has actually taught me that it's uncertain. I've had no excuse but to accept the deep insecurity, or the wisdom of insecurity. I think it was Alan Watts who wrote a book called The Wisdom of Insecurity. And once you do that, I don't know, everything just becomes a lot easier in a sense, you know. So I have been equipped through serendipity, through the challenges that life has sent me, to accept whatever life throws at me. It doesn't mean that, you know.
Sorry, you make it sound
Sorry,
like,
go ahead.
of course, as human beings, one of the greatest impulses that we have is to want to control things. We feel safe when we can control, even if we can just control our next meal or the temperature in our home or whatever it might be, right? It's just such an ingrained sort of impulse to control, right? But when you talk about a life of serendipity, it also sort of implies a life that is fluid in every perfect sense of the word, a life where the liver is willing to go along with whatever it is that comes their way, right? I mean, to not rely on plans, but to rely on serendipity. And when I keep that in mind and read your memoir, it also strikes me that you've made unusual choices, right? In terms of, you said, of course, here you are, you know, famous at a very young age, and like you said, building up that image, embracing that sort of celebrity that has come your way. But then you've also said no to projects, you've turned down projects, you've left India at the peak of your career and to do something else, and you've come back. You've also, in a sense, not been sure that you wanted to be at the heart of Bollywood, and you know, you were happy in sort of wherever you were in your life, in your career. And then, of course, there's this constant movement, right? From city to city, from country, continent to continent, living in different places. And in a sense, you're still doing that, you know.
Yeah.
Moved to Bombay, from Hong Kong, you know. Of course, I'm talking to you when you're in Singapore, researching electrical storms. So you're still sort of on the move. And what I wonder, and again, it's one of those big questions that I've been asking you, so apologies in advance, but what I wonder is how your decision-making process has changed through the years. And perhaps, you know, your spiritual journey will be able to shed some light onto this. Maybe it's intertwined with how your decision-making process has changed, maybe not, but I'd love to hear about that.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question, Pragya. And actually, I'm going to try to simplify it. And simplify my answer, because I could, again, go on, and there's so many different threads and points to this. But in a sense, for me, what has become very simple about life and being able to surrender. Serendipity also implies an aspect of surrender to what is. There's two things I want to say. First of all, I've always had a belief that, like, you know, sorry, let me frame it this way. I think that everybody in the world can be divided in according to the belief system, and there's two of them at your core. And either you believe that life is for you, or you believe that life is against you. So just to give you an example, if you believe that life is against you, you believe that, again, that you're the captain of the ship, and that life is a competition, and that life is a struggle, and that you have to constantly be alert, and you have to constantly, like, you know, you have to make, I don't know, write down your goals for the next 20 years. You know what I mean? It's just, right? And if you believe that life is for you, you'll obviously come at it through a very different lens. I mean, it's not, it doesn't imply that you're passive. I'm not a passive person at all. But you open yourself to miracles and surprises, and you understand that there's a bigger picture, that you are not everything. You're able to zoom out and, you know, understand that there are things that you will never understand, and submit to that, and understand that it's okay, that life has your back. But I think, in essence, when I look at how I came to this way of being, it was actually more of a homecoming, I want to say. And I remember I was in Dharamshala, and it was a sensation when I was sitting there during it was an introduction to Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism course, and they were talking about how our essential nature is crystal, that we are actually pure. It's just that we have forgotten our way, and that all basically untoward actions, that all what you might categorize as bad actions or evil actions come from ignorance or from forgetting who we are. So it was very strange. I remember, you know, spontaneously breaking into tears. And so what my sort of spiritual seeking has done, along with the experiences, along with what life has taught me along the way, is send me home. It's actually created a home inside me, so that all I have to do is access my own instinct. And I really trust my own inner guidance and my own inner instinct more than anything else. And that has actually simplified my life so much. You know, so my life has done a 180. I trust. I have a faith, and it's not necessarily a blind faith. Again, people sometimes have a reaction to the word faith. It's a faith that is built on proof, on experience, but it's also accessing another aspect of ourselves. You know, we have our mind that is a great tool, but it's not the only way that we have to navigate our way through the world. And sometimes the mind can be very, very troublesome, because it's the mind's job to analyze and to judge and to criticize and to come up with worst case scenarios. And that we all have access to a deeper, more enduring wisdom. And so it's been as simple as tapping into that. And since I've done that, I mean, you know, it's not that I don't get anxious, it's not that I don't get negative thoughts, but I don't get consumed by them. And so it's really, in a weird way, it's like that lovely, I think it's a T.S. Eliot poem that I love, that I can't quote, unfortunately, but, you know, he says it's all about coming back to where you started and knowing it for the first time, you know. And I think that, you know, my story, and perhaps for a lot of us, our stories, is perhaps about being able to go out into the world, but ultimately it leads you back home, and your home is within you. It's inside you.
It's incredibly inspirational for me, particularly, to hear you say this, because I think I definitely believe that life spent honing one's instinct is really the best sort of life.
I do get that impression from you. I really do. So I felt like you would understand what I'm saying.
That's exactly what pragya means. It's the instinctive knowledge that you're born with.
Yeah, and also, like, you know, I mean, it's honed as well. You know what I mean? It's a primal instinct. We all have it. Yeah. It's in us.
Yeah.
And it's been inculcated in us through evolution. And it's just that I think over these last years, ever since the Industrial Revolution, I think that we have actually moved so far from what makes us human.
Yeah.
That we have to really make a superhuman effort to reclaim that, to reclaim all the aspects of ourselves that are inconvenient really to an industrialized age.
Yeah. Couldn't
That's how I
agree
see it.
more. Lisa, I believe that we're running out of time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you 2 more questions. I don't see any questions on the screen, so I'm just going to take advantage of the fact that we don't have questions from the audience and go ahead and ask you my questions. And I couldn't possibly let you go without talking about what your memoir is actually believed to be, which is a cancer memoir, which of course, like I said, it's not, but it is a very important chapter in your life. And there's so many things to ask. Perhaps I'll start with how you processed the diagnosis and how it altered the relationship that you have or that you've been building up with your mind and your body.
Well, I think that, and I mean, thank you again for asking that question. And yes, I mean, I do end up getting a little defensive in general when Close to the Bone is positioned as a cancer memoir, because of course it's not. And that would in fact even be disappointing to someone who would buy it and think that it would be purely about my cancer journey. But having said that, it started out being a cancer memoir. And it was while I was decoding my cancer journey that I realized that nothing happens in isolation, that my cancer did not happen in isolation from the rest of my life. And so I kept trying to, as I was connecting dots, I kept going further and further and further back in my personal history. And that's when I realized, oh my God, this was planted in me. This malady was planted in me many, many years ago. And that is even how it built into a memoir. And that's a fact of our life. We are not completely disconnected. We're not disconnected from the people around us, from our environment, and neither are the events in our life. The events in our life that we're experiencing today were often seeded or planted many, many years ago. So that's how I approached, even when I was diagnosed with cancer. It was really strange because you know instinctively that there's something very wrong with you. And I knew for, in fact, a number of years I was ignoring the signs. And I like saying that there was nothing less in a cancer diagnosis that would make me stop and actually implement the lifestyle changes that I needed to make and that I wanted to make. It simply is that I was driven on this program. We all have these set programs that end up driving us almost to madness. You know, my lifestyle was so crazy. But anyway, so I understood instinctively when I was diagnosed, now I can finally address that hidden trauma that is buried deep inside me. So it was, I don't know why, there's no logical explanation for why I didn't completely panic. I mean, of course, you know, I was perturbed by it, but I somehow knew deep inside me, again, in the small, quiet voice, that often you have to sit very still in order to tap into and to hear. The small, quiet voice said to me, this is not it. This is not the end of the line for you. This is something you have to pass through. And I knew that it would be sort of a great practice. It would be a great, almost sadhana, you know, it would be a great sadhana that I would have to go through. And indeed it was. And of course I would get a lot of other conflicting negative ideas, but by then, because I had immersed myself in this attitude of seeking and a lot of meditation, and had internalized both a lot of Buddhist principles, and I also studied a lot of Osho. I used to go to the Osho ashram quite a lot, and I find that they both gave me the tools to be able to pass through my cancer with some level of equanimity, but not equanimity, but perhaps being able to see things from outside myself, because it's only when we're immersed in the storyline that we get, I think, you know, there's a danger of being pulled under the waves, you know. So that, I think, is what definitely helped me a lot.
Well, I am enjoying this conversation. I could go on and on and on, particularly the soundtrack to this conversation, which is that storm outside.
Yeah, it's awesome, isn't it? I arranged that for you.
Of course you did.
Dramatic. Dum, dum, dum.
I think there are questions. I I mean, I don't know how quite this operates because we don't have them on chat, but I believe there are people who want to ask questions. I can possibly take 2 questions. We can take them both together. I don't know how I could do that.
Pragya, this is Urvi. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to unmute them one by one so that they can ask their questions, and then we can put them on mute again while you and Lisa take them up.
Okay, Urvi, so just let's just take 2 questions. We take them together and then Lisa can answer them.
Sure. Okay. So the first one is from Gunjan. I'm just going to unmute them so that they can ask.
Hi, Lisa.
Hi, Gunjan.
Okay, so we've met before, but anyway, I'm going to cut it short. You said that life could be for you or against.
I'm sorry. You have to, like, literally the thunder is so loud. I didn't hear that. Sorry.
You said that life could be for you or against you.
Yes.
So when you, I feel personally that it's very difficult to believe that life is for us when we are in a situation, for example, when you were diagnosed. So what would you like to say about that? I mean, I feel that once we pass that situation and we overcome that, that's when we can look back and think that, yeah, this was for us and it was meant to change us. So what do you say about
No,
that?
I mean, that's a great question. Absolutely, we can only often understand things when we look in the rear view mirror. But remember that leading up to my diagnosis, I think I had had so many experiences, very heightened experiences in my life that had created the faith in that statement that life is for me, because I'd been through negative experiences that I realized in retrospect had built me to be a better person, that had actually, or had sent my life on a tangent or a direction that I hadn't anticipated, and I ended up where I needed and wanted to be, you know? So again, it's part of that very human impulse to say, I need to understand this, and I need to know how this is going to end. And that part of my practices has been in letting go of that and understanding that, like, look, if I look back on my life, it's all ended exactly if it needs to be. And let me also say, we are too small. Our understanding is sometimes too small. Now I'm speaking on a very larger philosophical level. Our understanding is too small. Maybe even if I had died, maybe that was the best outcome. How do we know as human beings? So there's a lovely story, if I'll tell you very, very quickly. I think it's a spiritual story, and I heard one spiritual master say this, but it might give you some context. So I don't tell it very well. I'll try to tell it very quickly. So there's an old man in a village, okay, and he's got a beautiful white stallion. Stop me if you've heard this. He's got a beautiful white stallion, and the entire village, all the villagers are very envious, right? They keep trying to buy it, and he refuses to sell the stallion. So then one day, the stallion has run away. So all the villagers come to the old man, and they say, see, we told you, old man, you're very, very unwise. You should have sold the stallion. You could have made money. So he says, look, I'm not going to say this is a good thing. I'm not going to say this is a bad thing. Let's just say my horse ran away and leave it at that. 2 days later, the horse returns, and the horse has brought with him 4 new, wild, beautiful stallions. So again, all the villagers come. Man, oh, you know, old man, you're so wise. You knew it. This is a great thing. Look at the luck that you've got. So again, the old man said, this is not a good thing. This is not a bad thing. Let us just say that my horse returned and brought with him 4 more horses. So the next day, his son is trying to tame the wild stallions, the 4 new horses. And in the process of doing that, he falls off one of the horses and he breaks his leg. And the villagers come to him and say, see, we told you, old man, you're cursed. This is such a bad thing. Your only son, and he's broken his leg. Again, the old man says, this is not a good thing. This is not a bad thing. I don't know. Let us just say my son fell off the horse and broke his leg. 1 week later, the kingdom goes to war. And every single young man, able-bodied young man, is recruited and sent to war and certain death. And again, all the villagers come to the old man and they say, my God, old man, how do you know these things? Look, you're so lucky. You've saved your son because he broke his leg. So it goes on and on. You can see where I'm going with this, right? We do not know in the moment. So there is an aspect of us that, you know, I mean, it's very much a matter of personal choice. I'll tell you the other thing that I tend to do. you know, like we were Pragya and I were talking about this idea that we have this impulse as human beings to control things. I have a meaning making impulse. I like to make meaning out of things. So perhaps it's my coping mechanism, but you know, even in a situation like what we're in today, perhaps there's an impulse, there's a belief system in me that will make meaning, that will impose my meaning, my belief system into what is happening today. And someone once told me, you know, you have a choice about your beliefs, so choose wisely your beliefs. You don't have to just accept, you know, the accepted notions and beliefs that are out there. So I don't know if that'll help.
Yes, thank you so much.
great.
Wonderful.
Do we have another question?
Yes, we'll just take one more from Alok. I'm
Yes.
just going to unmute him.
Wow, it's a real party going on out there now.
Very envious. We could do it. Sorry.
Am I audible?
Yes, hi Alok, I can hear you.
Hi. Thank you, Lisa. It has been a wonderful session, and you have really opened up. My question is that you spoke about an element of spirituality in your life.
Element of, sorry?
Spirituality. Spiritualism.
Spirituality. Sorry. I'm so sorry. Yes.
Do tell me, has there been any mentor or a spiritual master in your life who has helped you and guided you to face the traumas and the challenges that you have faced in your life so far?
Thank you, Alok. Okay, thank you, Alok, very much for this question. So yes, I have been the beneficiary of incredible teachers and guides. And I've written about it in my book, and Close to the Bone. Some of them have just appeared. There was a woman called Nadama that just appeared in my life. And she was a great mentor, great spiritual mentor. I have studied a lot of Tibetan Buddhism. I go on regular retreats. As I mentioned Osho. I've been very open to a lot of different masters. I think that they all say very similar things in very different ways. But obviously, I'm very inclined towards both Buddhism and Hinduism. And I guess I've created my own kind of melange of the two. I am not someone who today necessarily seeks out a spiritual master, because I have been so lucky, so incredibly blessed that the people who have taught me and have guided me have actually directed me back to myself. So the master is inside you. But of course, it's been a very, very long process in getting here. I don't think I don't put myself in any sort of a platform. I don't think that I've realized anything. But you know, it's helped me in some very quantifiable way in living my life with acceptance and peace and determination as well. So small steps, but you know, it's a very I mean, you could say, I guess my spiritual seeking is a very, very important aspect of my life. It's always run in parallel with the rest of my life. It's the hidden part of my life, because obviously people only see the public persona, but alongside with the public persona or being on sets or acting or whatever it is, wow, hi God. The universe is speaking to us. That has always been active, and it's run a parallel course in my life ever since I was very, very young.
Thank you very much.
Okay, well then,
thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, for speaking with me, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Listening to us. I can promise you whatever we spoke about is really just the tip of the iceberg. The book is absolutely delightful. Buy it and read it.
I'm so humbled. I'm so humbled.
No, I mean that
really.
from the bottom of my heart. And no better time than now, really, to read the book. So get it on your Kindle and or get a physical copy and just read it. And over to you, Meeta. Thank you for giving us this platform.
Thank you,
Thank
Pragya,
you.
for playing that part of my role. I was just going to plug the book heavily, which is what really we want to do. We want to inculcate the reading habit in people. I can't thank you, Lisa, enough for being so forthcoming. And I think you've touched all the hearts and souls of all the people who have viewed in and listened to you. And Pragya, I don't think I can praise you enough for being such a deft moderator and giving off so much of yourself to a session, which you've always done. So I'm not surprised. So I'm going to once again Prabha Ketan Foundation for giving us this opportunity to keep running Right Circle, and thank our presenting sponsors, Sri Siemens, and also our associates once again for another beautiful session of Right Circle. But I can't thank you and Pragya enough.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to all our audiences for having joined us once again. And please do read the book, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thank you. Thank you, Meeta. Thank you so much, Pragya. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye. Love this. Bye.